Mario, I want you to explain to our audience the importance that casts the character of Judge Cahill in Minneapolis in this trial. What was it about the Midwest that colored this trial?
No, what we saw front and center, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, is that the Midwest has been, just front and center in American politics, whether it was the previous administration, whether what we saw in the election of Joe Biden as well. And that's encapsulated in many ways in what we saw in the George Floyd trial, right? In the heart of the Midwest, in Minneapolis. We saw the protests, the unrest, the tensions between the communities, between the police and the communities of color as well. And then yesterday we saw a result that we quite frankly have rarely seen in the country, and in the conviction of Derek Chauvin.
Is there a middle ground in Washington, or are we a nation polarized within the House, within the Senate, and of course within the White House?
We are polarized, but there's a caveat to that, Tom. I mean, you saw that yesterday Tim Scott, who is the only black Republican senator from South Carolina, he issued a pretty strong statement in support of the outcome of the trial. You saw Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota as well issue that. So we see some glimpses of bipartisanship. There is the typical Washington gridlock. That's not to be mistaken. But there are signs of some type of bipartisanship. There are some glimmers that Washington can come together and get something done.
Mario, this is not just a U.S. story. There has been an international response with a number of leaders of nations from France to the United Kingdom weighing in on this. What is your view in the importance internationally, both for the United States and more broadly for race relations?
Well, what we saw over the past year is something that we haven't seen probably since the 1960s. We saw widespread protests. We saw that videotape of George Floyd's death galvanized activists the world over. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement spread from the U.S. to Europe, as you mentioned. And so it threw a lot of support. It raised awareness. We saw everything from just on the ground people kind of being engaged all the way up into corporations looking at themselves in the mirror and trying to make some really tough decisions.
There's also a question of whether this verdict galvanizes the movement toward police reform, which we heard a lot about over the past 12 months, or whether it puts a damper on it because it does give the impression that in this case, justice was served. What's your view from the people who you speak to in Washington, D.C.?
Well, as I mentioned, there is gridlock. There's no doubt about it. There's Joe Biden President Biden used yesterday a significant amount of his remarks to talk about or throw support behind the George Floyd and Policing Act. That passed the House some time ago. It's been languishing in the Senate. The White House says that it's been engaged on Capitol Hill and in negotiations to try to get that across the finish line. But there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate. There's the filibuster still. There are some tough, there's a tough hill to slog in order to get that across. But again, as I mentioned, there are some glimmers of hope in terms of bipartisanship. There are some people on both sides of the aisle that at least recognize that something has to be done in terms of police reform.
Mario Parker, President Biden has suggested a second term is in order. The jury's out on that. And if he does that, he's really trying to reframe a relationship with the unions. Can President Biden reframe a relationship with police enforcement officers nationwide?
Well, that's going to be really, really tough for him. We've seen this delicate dance that he's had over the course of both his campaign and then in office, all the way up until yesterday. We saw the president express very, very sympathetic feelings toward the Floyd family and that plight, and also communities of color. But he also was careful to acknowledge that not all police are bad, to acknowledge that there needs to just be systemic reform, that most police officers want to get up in the morning and do their job and come back home. So he's trying not to inflame tensions there. There are some Republicans who have said that he's too soft on crime, that he's anti-law enforcement. We saw that thing pop up during the campaign. But he's in a tough position where he's got to thread the needle here, and he has to kind of pull off this delicate dance.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quicktake now for insight in an instant.